Hi, it's Rob from the Bush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint a Nurgle Poxbringer. So the first colour we're going to use is Citadel Mephiston Red. I'm going to use this to paint all the open wounds and his insides. So all around the inside of the stomach cavity there. Now you've got lots of wounds and sores and things like that on his body that you can paint with this as well. You don't need to paint the burst boils or anything like that straight away. You can hang fire with those because we just use a bit of Carroburg Crimson later on. But for the main wounds around his mouth and the stomach cavity there, just give them a good coat of Mephiston Red. So you can see there, we've started doing all the red. Now we're going to move on to the Citadel Leadbelcher and paint his sword with that. You want to make sure that you give it a nice coat of Leadbelcher. You've got a nice smooth streakless layer on there. Now the miniature itself has been sprayed with Deathguard green before starting this, because I find that quite a nice base for doing Nurgling green and that kind of stuff. So Deathguard green to start with. Now we're going to move on to Citadel Rakarth Flesh. And for this we're going to paint all the bone, and the horns, his teeth, his claws, all that kind of stuff. Not to forget his toenails and the little sort of spiny bits growing out the back of his feet. Also got the horns on the Nurgling as well. Now we're going to go on to Citadel Pink Horror. We're going to be using this to do the entrails, which are hanging out of his stomach. That's a really quick method that you use to paint the entrails. It's the first base coat that you get. It's also worth noting that on this particular miniature, the entrails go down between his legs and behind him as well. They're dragging on the floor, which I don't think I paint them up in this part, but I do realise later on I paint them up. So as you paint them now, it's worth painting the entrails just behind him. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Xereus purple to paint the organ that's hanging out the side there. I imagine it to be a liver or something like that, which is a deep reddish kind of colour, so I thought the purple would probably be a decent base colour for that. Could be wrong, could be his stomach or anything, not really too sure. Next on is Mechanicus Standard Grey, and this is just to do the stone at his feet. Hindsight, it's probably worth doing the bits between the innards with the colour of the stone that you're using first. But as it happens, I didn't paint the innards straight away anyway. Okay, now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Ulthuan Grey. I'm going to use this on the human head, which is hanging from the Nurgling. Give it a nice smooth coat of this. Like so. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Mournfang Brown. I'm going to use this to do the hair on the human head. Now there's going to be a little bit of Fulgurite copper. I'm going to use this to paint the bells. Now I'll do one bell in Leadbelcher, and I'll do the other two with Fulgurite copper. So the Fulgurite copper ones, we can then use the nickel oxide to do some verdigris on it. Nice little shot of the Goliath who are waiting to be painted there. But give a nice smooth coat of the Fulgurite copper to the bells. Like so. Next up we're going to use some Citadel Agrax Earthshade and start on the shades. So we're going to use the Agrax Earthshade to do the Fulgurite copper that we've just applied, and also the hair on the human head. Like so. Now there's going to be some Citadel Druchii Violet. We're going to use this to do all of the red, so the mouths, the insides of his stomach cavity, and the open wounds we're going to do with this. Not going to paint this onto the entrails or anything like that though. Like so. Next shade is going to be Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm going to use this on his tongue and on the organ and also on the entrails which are hanging down. Like so. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Biel-Tan green. I'm going to use this on a Nurgling. I'm going to use a different shade of green to do the Poxbringer himself, just so that the Nurgling and the Poxbringer are different colours. It'll be very similar the way we do the skin, but with the different green shades, it does make them look different enough so they don't blend in together. Like so. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Athonian Camoshade. I'm going to do all of the skin of the Poxbringer. Now there's plenty of folds and creases on them, so you want to make sure that you've got some of the shade resting in those creases to darken them up. I'm going to use some Citadel Reichland Flesh Shade, and I'm going to do the skin on the human head. Like so. Now it's Citadel Nuln Oil, and you're going to paint all the silvery metallics with this. You've got the Leadbelcher on the sword and also on the loops of some of the bells. Like so. Next up is Citadel Seraphim Sepia, and this is to do all of the Rakarth flesh, the bones and the horns. This is the first Nurgle fellow I've painted for a long while. I really did enjoy painting them. You remember why they take so long to do now, because you do lots of layers and there's lots of little effects you can do on them. But that's made me want to carry on doing some more Death Guard and some more Nurgle Demons, so you'll probably expect to see a few of them in the next few months. And once you've finished the Seraphim Sepia, you move on to the next colour. Now we're going to use some Burnt Umber. I'm just going to do, it's actually a piece of entrail which is coming down the bottom here, but I wanted to make it look as revolting as possible. So we're going to have one of the entrails emptying its contents onto the base. Now we're going to start working on the skin, so we're going to use Citadel Nurgling Green to do the first layer. You want to think about where the light is going to catch him, and also you want to think about leaving the Athonian Camoshade in the recesses on the Poxwalker and the Biel-Tan green on the recesses of the Nurgling. You want to get a nice base layer of this, try and leave as many details in there as possible. There's lots of little pockmarks and holes and indents in his skin and little ridges and stuff. And we can add to them with the next highlight. So now we're going to add some Dorn yellow to the Nurgling green to lighten that up, and now we're going to do a highlight of this. Now I went with the yellow instead of the white, which I'd usually use, just because it gives it a slightly sicker green colour. I mean that isn't sick as in not well. You think about where the light is going to be catching him and highlighting those specific areas. You can also, on some of the flaps of skin and things like that, you'll notice a bit later on maybe that I've done a few painted on creases, so the skin's sagged and it's creased a little bit. For the next highlight, we're going to add some more Dorn yellow to the previous mix, just to get a nice lighter shade of that. As this is the extreme highlight, you really want to make sure that you're only getting it on a place where a lot of light will get. So you're just going to be highlighting the previous highlight. Keep that going around the whole model. And once you've finished that layer, we can move on to the next part. So we're going to use Citadel Dawn Yellow now. I'm just going to use that pure on its own, and this is just to do all of the boils and the spots which are over his body. There's quite a few of these, so make sure you get each one. If you find out later that you've missed one, that's not a problem, you can go back and do it. Once you've finished all the pustules, you can move on to the next layer. Now I'm going to use a little bit of pure white. It's just white from Vallejo that we're using here. We're just going to do the Poxbringer's eye. So as always, you want to drag the brush from the tip downwards, so that you're not splaying the fibres of the brush. So always drag the brush away from the point. Now we're going to use Vallejo Black. We're just going to do the pupil and the eye. Like so. Next we're going to use some white mixed with Citadel Dawn Yellow. We're just going to use this to paint around all the burst pustules. So you've got all these like kind of lumpy circles where they've burst and spilled all the contents out. So we're just going to give them a little coat of a Dawn Yellow white mix, just like the flaps of skin that are still hanging there. Now to start reapplying the colour to the Nurgling, we're going to start using some Citadel Nurgling Green. Just like you did with the Poxbringer, you're just going to be using this to put the colour back onto him, making sure that you leave the Biel-Tan green shade in the recesses. I'm using the Army Painter Wargamer character brush here. It does have a better point than the medium layer brush that I usually use for everything. So it allows you to get the details in, get the smaller lines in there. Now we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo White to the Nurgling green. This just to lighten it up a little bit. Because we're using white rather than the Dorn yellow that we use for the Poxbringer, that'll mean that they're slightly different shades of green. They'll look slightly different. Similar enough that they look part of the same kind of unit, but different enough that they're not identical in colour and they stand out from each other. Going to carry on with that and then we'll return for the next highlight. So next up we're going to use a little bit more Vallejo White mixed in with the previous mix, and we're just going to do one final highlight on a Nurgling. This time you want to be highlighting just the top ridges as though the light's catching those areas more. That brings out a lot of the details there and makes them stand out a bit more. When we come back, we'll move on to the next part. So now I'm going to work on his sword, so we're going to use a little bit of Agrax Earthshade. This to add the first part of the weathering that we're going to be doing. Applying Agrax Earthshade like this will just give it that kind of dulled down, dirty, grimy look. Which is what we want to do for his sword. Like so. Now I'm going to do similar with the Citadel Seraphim Sepia. You can be a bit more liberal with this, applying it to different areas, applying it over some of the Agrax Earthshade areas. And you just want to be putting this on because it adds the yellow discoloration that you can do before you start applying rust effects. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Fulgurite Copper because we're going to chop over to painting up the bells while the shades dry on the sword there. So we're going to be leaving some of the Agrax Earthshade in the recesses and also in the sort of like angles of the bell before the bottom flares out. You want to leave a little bit of the shade there and around 3 kind of Nurgle spots on the front there. With that done, we're now going to use Citadel Nihilak Oxide technical paint. I'm going to start applying that around the bell to show the corrosion on there. You can apply it as thick or as thin as you want. I've tried to do it with some thicker areas where the bell's not going to have caught or knocked into anything, to scrape off some of the verdigris, and some thinner streakier areas where maybe it's not quite as corroded or weathered. Do that on both of the bells, and once you've finished that, we're returning back to the sword because the shades have dried. We're going to use Citadel Typhus Corrosion. When you're applying this, you want to think about where the blade of the sword isn't going to be getting caught on anything. So if he's stabbing the sword through someone's armour, it's going to scrape off all the ridges, so the lumpy rusty parts are mainly going to be in those recesses where the blade goes in. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Riser Rust to add some rust colouring to the Typhus Corrosion. Make sure you leave it to dry properly before you start doing this, otherwise you will rub it off and it becomes quite grotty looking. I'm trying to do less of the rust and the Typhus Corrosion towards the point of the sword, because obviously the point of the sword is the bit that's going to get jabbed into people. It's going to rub off a lot more of that at the top there. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Necron Compound to dry paint, and we're just going to dry brush this over the edges of the sword to highlight those ridges where the sword would be scraped as it's getting stabbed into people. It's going to knock off any of the rust which would be on those parts of the blade. Also the bottom part there, where maybe the sword's being leaned up against walls or that kind of thing, like so. Now going to work on the bone, so we're going to start with Citadel Rakarth flesh. We start with his toenails. You've also got the horns on his head, the kind of spiny tree thing that's grown out of his back, and also the horns of the Nurgling, his fingernails and his teeth that we're going to be doing with this colour. There's plenty to work on. And once we've finished all the Rakarth flesh, we'll move on to the next colour. So we've got that base layer back on. Now I'm going to use Citadel Ushabti bone. I'm going to start applying this further up the horns and the spines, and lower down on the teeth, further out on the toes. This is so that you want the horn getting lighter the further away it gets from the Poxbringer. Now we're going to add a little bit of white to the previous mix. And just start applying this to the very tips and along the ridges and all of these bony sections. Now we're going to start working on the hair of the human head. I'm going to apply some Mournfang brown, making sure that you leave the Agrax Earthshade in the recesses there. It's going to be bringing out the colours of the strands. I'm going to add a little tiny bit of Rakarth flesh to the Mournfang brown. I'm just going to highlight that hair. Like so. One final time, we're going to add a little tiny bit more Rakarth flesh to the previous mix, and we're just going to do another little layer of highlights on the hair. Only a little tiny bit here, just highlighting those highlights you've previously put on. Like so. Working on the skin of the human head, we're going to use some Citadel Deepkin flesh and reapply a bit of the pale withdrawn colour from the face there. He's got stitches going over his eyes and his mouth, which is why they look quite untidy. So we'll be adding a colour for them a bit later. I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo White mixed in with the Deepkin flesh. I'm just going to do one highlight of the skin with this. Okay, so now we're going to start working on the stone at his feet. We're going to use some Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey just to reapply some colour back on the stone. Obviously if you're painting this a different colour, the stone, depending on how you base the rest of your Nurgle, then just paint it up the same way that you paint any of the other rocks in that force. Once you finish that, we'll go on to the next layer. So the first highlight of the stone, we're going to be using Citadel Dorn stone. It's a nice lighter shade of grey, very similar to the Vallejo London grey. You just want to be highlighting areas of this. It doesn't matter too much if it's a bit patchy the way you apply the grey, because it is stone, so it's not all going to be a constant colour. We'll be trying to highlight around the edges and the ridges and bring out the detail in that stone, as well as lightening some of the larger areas of the stone too. Next up, we're going to be using some Vallejo White, and all we're going to be doing this time is lightly dry brushing this across the angles and the edges of the rock, just to bring out the detail in that. Like so. So this is actually reapplying the pink horror from Citadel. You're just going to be leaving the Carroburg crimson in the recesses and in the kind of sunken areas of all the intestines. You're going to be highlighting the areas which bulge out, just to bring the colour back out on those. It's quite a fun part of the model to paint this. It gives you a chance to be a bit revolting with it and make it look quite horrific. So I'm now going to highlight that using Citadel Emperor's Children. You're not going to be doing a massive highlight on this, just little areas, little touches of the lighter pink, just to bring some brightness to it and bring out those details. Like so. And once you've finished this, we're going to move on to the next colour. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Xereus purple. We're just going to add a little bit of colour back to the organ in his stomach cavity there. Like so. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Mephiston red. I'm going to be using this to apply some of the colour back to the ridges and things inside the stomach cavity and all those open wounds that he's got on his body. Now it doesn't matter if you miss any of the details or put a bit too much in a certain area. As long as you've got a bit of the highlights there and you've got it on some of the details, that'll be fine. It's mainly just to add a little bit of brightness and colour back to the wounds before we apply some of the gore to it. Once you've got that, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Rhinoxhide. I'm going to use this just to paint the little kind of threads that are holding the guy's eyes and mouth shut. I do find he's a bit of a pain to paint, to be honest, but take your time with them, you'll get them all done. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Carroburg Crimson. Now what we're using this for is all of those little open and burst pustules. We're going to do a little trickle of blood coming from each of those. Think about where the blood had run on his body if he stood upright, as well as when he's walking. You're going to get trickles going all of those different directions. You want to get some nice gore going on there. If you also think about between his legs where he's got his entrails hanging down, you're going to get that rubbed against the legs, so you're going to have a bit of gore on there too. Around all the open wounds, you want to get some running from those too. So if you look at him now, he's got plenty on there. Now I'm going to use some Vallejo red wash, and we're going to use this to go around each of the pustules, because you need to make them look as though they're slightly inflamed, so the skin's a bit raw and tender around them. You can also use this as well if you want around the open wounds or the edges of any of the skin. I used a bit of Carroburg Crimson, as you can see from the wound on his shoulder there. It does look like a little bit of raw steak inside the wound, which is the effect I kind of wanted to go for. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Agrax Earthshade, and you're going to add some of this to the little holes and the puncture wounds and the slices in his innards. You can also add some of this running down the inside of his legs as well, from where the blood sort of just got dirty and filthy. You can also add Carroburg Crimson to the entrails, which are at the bottom here too, because there's going to be plenty of that being dragged behind him on the floor. So just going to go on to the Nurgling's eyes quickly. We're going to paint each of the eyes with a little spot of white. Like so. Now we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo Black just to put a pupil on each of those eyes. Like so. Next up, going back to the Carroburg Crimson, I'm going to use a tiny little bit of this just to paint around each of the Nurgling's eyes, and then also around the eyeball of the Poxbringer. Makes it look like his eyes are a bit raw and tender, maybe got a bit of pink eye going on there. Now we're going to add some gore to it using Citadel Blood for the Blood God. And this is a great paint for making the insides look quite wet and sticky and horrible. So when you're painting this on, if you're painting it down the entrails like I do here, you don't want to completely coat them in it. You want to do streaks and things like that, as though they're smooth, so blood's run off it, so you've got some of the pink showing through. You don't want to completely coat them in it so it's just a big red mess there. You just want to do little streaks, little spots of blood on it, so it's all running off. You can also add this to the open wounds and any of the open pustules too, so you can apply this how you want to. Now we're going to use a little tiny bit of Citadel Gloss Varnish. This because I've sprayed the miniature with matte varnish at this point, and I'm just simply adding the gloss varnish to all the insides to make them look as though they're still wet. Applying it to his tongue as though that's still wet, and also the eyes of the Nurgling and the Poxbringer himself. By adding this to it, it does add the shine back to the specific areas you're applying it, and that does make it look like it's still wet and still fresh. And that is the finished Poxbringer. That's a great model to paint. It does take a bit of time because of the amount of detail on there, but it really is worth putting the effort into it. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media linked below. Thanks very much.